to today's Zoom. I'm Gladys Fain, Hurrah's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair, and we're pleased to have you. Thank you for taking advantage of this wonderful opportunity to hear from today's presenter, Bill Dedman, about Newsday's 3-year investigation into housing discrimination and fair housing violations on Long Island. Before we get started, however, I'd like to ask everyone to make sure you are on mute. If you have a question for Bill, please enter it in the chat and we'll circle back at the end of the presentation. First, though, I'd like to mention that this presentation is made possible by our generous sponsors, Atlantic Bay Mortgage Group, Atlantic Coast Mortgage, and Prosper Insurance, and is presented in tandem with Virginia Peninsula Association of Realtors and Williamsburg Area Association of Realtors. We are happy to have our fellow realtors from VPAR and WAR here with us today. Thank you to our sponsors. I'm honored to share this bio of our presenter. Bill Dedman is a Pulitzer and Peabody Award-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, and keynote speaker. He has spoken on fair housing and fair lending issues to the National Association of Realtors, the Federal Reserve, HUD, and banking and real estate associations. Bill received the 1989 Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting for his work at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on The Color of Money, his series on racial discrimination by banks and savings and loan associations in middle-income Black neighborhoods. The Color of Money led to expanded federal laws on disclosure of loan data, new financing for middle-income homebuyers, and greater awareness of systemic discrimination. You can find the articles in The Color of Money online at powerreporting.com. 30 years later, Bill was one of 4 lead reporters on Newsday's undercover investigation of racial steering by real estate agents, Long Island Divided, which he will explore with us today. The investigation, published in November 2019, revealed that Long Island's dominant residential real estate brokerages help reinforce racial segregation through illegal steering of customers. Newsday's team received several national awards for their work, including a Peabody Award. Long Island Divided and its 40-minute documentary film, Testing the Divide, are online at newsday.com/divided. Bill also uncovered the case of the reclusive copper heiress, Uguette Clarke, in 2010, documenting her life and reports for NBC News. His nonfiction book, the #1 New York Times bestseller, Empty Mansions: The Mysterious Life of Uguette Clarke and the Spending of a Great American Fortune, tells the true story of Clarke and her father, the Gilded Age industrialist who founded Las Vegas. Bill is a frequent speaker for financial planning groups and charities on the lessons learned from the Clarke family's failures in estate planning. Bill has reported for the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Boston Globe. Welcome. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Gladys. Thank you. I'm excited to be in Virginia, to have this opportunity to share with you our Newsday team's work on fair housing. Thank you so much for inviting me, and to everybody who helped set this up. I really appreciate it. It's surprising that so many real estate associations around the country have responded to a newspaper's investigation and are using it to provoke an important conversation. So I'm hoping that together we can dive into looking at some clips from our Newsday video of agents in action, perhaps not on their best days. And I'm hoping that we can talk about some of the hard questions, like what agents can say about schools. My goal is for this session to be helpful to you, but also challenging, something for you to think about and to take action on.
Bill, you won the Pulitzer Prize for an investigation into mortgage lending practices. I thought it might be interesting for our viewers to hear a brief summary of that investigation, and how does that investigation compare with this one?
Gladys, the stories in the Atlanta newspapers were called The Color of Money. They were about redlining, the old practice of mortgage lenders, especially banks, doing business on one part of the map, but not another. Well, collecting deposits from all parts of the map, making loans in only some part of the map. And this was back in the late 1980s. Redlining had gotten a lot of attention earlier, but seemed to be thought of as something from the past. We found lenders, particularly the banks in Atlanta, making home loans in white areas, even lower income white areas, but not in Black areas, even the higher income areas that were home to Coretta Scott King and Andrew Young and the vice presidents at Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines. A couple of elements of that story resonate for the one we're talking about today. First, the customer would have no way to know where the banks didn't make loans. The customer would have no basis for making a complaint. The banks told us we've never received any complaints. But we looked at how the banks operated. We found differences in branch locations where branches had been open and closed, differences in which real estate agents the banks marketed to, and even differences in where customers could put in a loan application. One lesson, I think, was that small actions, perhaps unintentional ones, can have a huge impact in perpetuating a segregated system. And I'd like to mention a more recent project for the Boston Globe looking at racial profiling in traffic stops in Massachusetts. Our series was called Speed Trap. It's online. An interesting thing about being stopped by an officer for speeding is that we were all speeding. And then again, you have no way to know if you're being treated equally. If you get a warning, if you get a break, did everyone else get a break today? If you get a ticket, does everyone else going that speed get a ticket? You have no way to know, and you would have no reason to complain. What we found in Massachusetts was that who gets a ticket and who gets a warning is pretty easy to predict if you know the race, sex, and age of the driver. For example, women much more often get a warning, especially younger women. We profiled a college student. She'd gotten 5 warnings in 6 weeks. But that break for young women, it goes away at about age 40. It's the same as who gets roles in Hollywood. Minorities almost always got the ticket, especially younger Black and Latino men. So there seemed to be some racial profiling at work in that decision made by the officer at the window. Again, the customers wouldn't know, but maybe even the officers wouldn't know how it breaks down. Another point is that, like with home mortgages, traffic tickets, we were looking at public records after the fact to see what had happened, and then to try to piece together, well, how does it happen? What were the circumstances? I think what's different about Long Island Divided is that it's a test that we were monitoring. We were not coming along later looking at records. With the video cameras, you can watch people violate the law. I also think that seeing specific agents and the names of their companies, having that caught on video and on the screen, helped lead to more impact and maybe a greater chance of some changes happening in the system.
Very interesting. The Newsday investigation has become the most prominent example of the existence of race bias in real estate. Why did Newsday start the investigation in the beginning?
Well, let me set the scene. So Long Island is so large, you can see it on a big map of the United States, stretching east of New York City, more than 100 miles. almost 3 million people in 2 counties. It's a heavily segregated suburb of New York City, perhaps the most heavily segregated in the nation. And what we mean by that is, although there's a lot of diversity overall, with people from all races and nationalities, especially African Americans, are concentrated in very few communities. Out of more than 200 communities on Long Island, a majority of the Black residents live in only 8. And we had heard anecdotes for years from Black home buyers encountering problems when they tried to shop for a home outside of those 8 communities. We heard this even from our own colleagues at the newspaper. So we decided to follow the methods that are used commonly by fair housing agencies, occasionally by government investigators, to do testing, with the addition of hidden cameras for video and audio. That's legal in New York, and it's legal in most states, including Virginia. Most state laws require only one person in a conversation, and that can be the tester, the home buyer, to consent to audio recording. Hidden audio recording is not allowed in about a dozen states, but still you can have testing everywhere. Testers can be debriefed, and we can make maps of the listings that they were given. Now, I'd like to show you an introductory part of our documentary film from Long Island Divided. What happened in this video clip surprised us, but we saw it time and again. One customer receives service from an agent, while another customer, seeing the same agent in the same circumstance, is refused service. Let me start this video. Just take a second to start it.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood.
Mixed neighborhood.
If agents are courteous and professional, how can you know that they're treating you equally compared with someone of a different race or ethnicity?
I have to say it without saying it, you know.
Behind smiles and handshakes, how do you know if they're giving you fewer options or suggesting different
I'm
areas?
not going to send you anything you want to do unless you don't want to store your car to buy your friend.
Or that rules don't apply to you and another home buyer in the same way?
Yeah, okay, I definitely
Long Island is one of America's most segregated suburbs. Newsday set out to discover what role real estate agents might play in keeping it that way, potentially affecting the quality of lives.
Technically, as a real estate agent, you should tell the buyers.
In house hunting, it's nearly impossible to see evidence of hidden discrimination. You would never know unless you go undercover.
In one test, Johnny Mae Alston was the black tester and Cindy Parry was the white tester. And they met with Anne-Marie Quealy-Bichon at Signature Premier Properties office in Cold Spring Harbor. They asked for the same thing. As often happens, the agent discussed getting pre-qualified or pre-approved for a mortgage by a bank, showing how much a buyer can spend on a house.
qualified, I guess. My husband's working with somebody in a bank. We've done some preliminary talks, you know, about getting pre-approval.
Neither had been pre-approved or pre-qualified. Here's what the agent told the black tester.
So I really need that. I won't take out anyone unless I do have a pre-qualification letter. So I need to, that means I can't pre-qualify for a mortgage. Oh, so that means I can't go out to see anything. I won't do it. You can try another person, but I don't have the time.
And without pre-approval, here's what the agent told the white tester.
What is your availability? When can you start looking at houses? I would say not this current week.
Cindy received 79 listings from this agent. Johnny Mae couldn't get any listings. And Cindy, the white tester, received 2 home tours. They had the same finances, the same budget, and they made the same request in the same area. But one was white, the other was black. The agent treated them differently.
Bill, would you give us a summary of the test? Who was tested and what was the outcome?
Yes. So, our team at Newsday focused on home sales only, no rentals. And we were sending out first-time home buyers. We'd send a white home buyer and then an Asian home buyer, or white and black, or white and then Hispanic. And we'd mix up who would go first to see the agent. The home buyers gave the agent the same circumstances. They were first-time home buyers, so selling another property was not involved. We chose testers of the same gender and roughly the same age. We dressed them in the same business casual style, bought shirts for the men. I went shopping at Nordstrom for similar purses for the women. They asked for the same number of bedrooms, had the same family size, and they were prepared to give the same income and same credit scores, but rarely were asked for any financial information other than mortgage pre-approval status, as you saw, on which they were identical. We shopped for houses from entry level. Now, in New York City area prices, entry level is about $400,000 to the high end, $7 million. Now, $7 million won't get you Alec Baldwin's house in the Hamptons, but it'll get you into his neighborhood. And it was always the same price, though, for both testers who were in a pair. And they saw the same agent. Now, that would not be necessary for a fair housing lawsuit or investigation. Under the law, two different agents at the same brokerage are also required to treat customers equally. But we thought it would be more fair and more persuasive to have the agent see both customers. Now, how did we pick the agents? We didn't. The brokerages picked which agents would be tested, though they didn't know it. Whoever was on the board to handle walk-ins or phone calls or internet contacts, that was the agent tested. We did 86 of these paired tests at 12 companies, 12 brands that together represent more than half of the sellers in our market. Familiar names: Coldwell Banker, Keller Williams, Century 21, Remax, as well as large regional brands and a couple of smaller ones too. Our team then reviewed more than 200 hours of videos to see how the customers were treated and analyzed and mapped thousands of listings to see what school districts and communities they had been directed to. We didn't feel comfortable being the referees, so we had two fair housing experts review each test for equal treatment. One had run a testing program for the Department of Justice, and the other is the law professor who wrote the textbook on fair housing law. Only if both of our referees independently threw a flag did we call an agent out of bounds. Now, before we published, we gave the agents and their brokers details so they could come in, watch the videos, and respond to our findings. So this was a careful effort. It took more than 3 years, because this was not a drive-by investigation. Now, the results. The agents gave unequal treatment in 40% of our tests, 4 out of 10 on average. But the results varied in interesting ways. Asian buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 19% of the time, 2 out of 10. Hispanic buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 39% of the time, 4 out of 10. And Black buyers were treated differently than their white counterparts 49% of the time, 5 out of 10. Now, most of the attention has been on that high difference for Black customers, but I'd say let's not lose sight of the rest. If 4 out of 10 Hispanic buyers, if 2 out of 10 Asian buyers are being treated poorly half a century after the civil rights laws were passed, those seem like high numbers as well. we viewed this as testing the gatekeepers in real estate to see how they perform. 2 of the 12 companies, the 2 smallest regional brands, were the only companies to pass all of their tests. It's fair to say, I think, that most of these major national and regional real estate companies were contributing to the racial segregation in our suburbs. I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, would the results be any different if we repeated the test in your community? If this weekend, 4 retiring police officers from Richmond come house hunting in Hampton and Chesapeake, one's white, one's black, one's Hispanic, one's Asian. Will they and their families on Monday go home with the same listings? Now, what sort of differences did we see? First, we saw steering. Agents directed 1 out of 4 of our minority home buyers into different communities and different school districts altogether than their white counterparts. We also saw differences in how buyers were screened or pre-approved. One buyer, a minority buyer, might be asked for ID, but the same agent would not ask the white buyer for ID. Some agents wouldn't help our Black or Hispanic buyer unless they signed an exclusive contract, but that same brokerage didn't require a contract of the white buyer. And then there were inappropriate comments by agents. You know, it's interesting because minority buyers were not subjected to racial comments or inappropriate remarks. We're past the days of signs out in the open saying whites only. Things are much more subtle now. It was the white buyers who heard the inappropriate comments about race and schools and crime. Here's a video clip which highlights this problem of inappropriate comments. It'll take me just a second to get it started. Please stand by. Just a moment. All right, let's see what we've got here.
Community came in, and they really took over Springs in Northwest Woods area.
Here, an agent gives conflicting advice about Freeport.
Now you have a bad school district, and that's not good for resale value. On the school bus, see the moms that are hanging out on the corners.
But you don't want to go there. It's a mixed neighborhood. It's mini United Nations.
Because comfortable in a certain demographic area that isn't heavily one way or another in terms of the people. Bayshore has 2 school districts, Brentwood and Bayshore. You don't want to have Brentwood school districts. You want to have Bayshore school district. I can't say anything, but I encourage you, I want you to go there at 10 o'clock at night with your wife, buy diapers. Go to that 7-Eleven. They didn't buy there.
No, that's great.
I have to say it without saying it, you know, you have the knowledge of the areas.
Yes.
You know. I don't want to use the word steer, but I try to use the word. I
listen,
educated the areas,
that's
you know.
Yeah. How are you, Russ? Hey, Russ. Good. How are you?
We're either waiting for the owner or waiting for the agent to show up.
You don't want to be. I don't think you should be now, Mon. I think you should probably just be Franklin Square.
And I remember specifically, he talked about steering.
Yes, that's what he said. Steering, yes.
Yeah. And in the same breath, he mentioned, well, steering's bad, but this is what I'm going to do.
There's something called steering. No steering, you know, like steering.
Oh, like a car or something?
No, like a horse, you know.
You know, it may be that some agents have, through the years, gotten an understanding that complying with the fair housing laws is some sort of political correctness, that it means not saying the wrong thing, or not saying the wrong thing that might offend the wrong person who might complain about it. Our tests suggest that we need more attention to steering, to what listings are given, to differential treatment, more attention on what people do and not just what they say. And are agents giving the same advice to all clients? Are agents treating all clients equally?
We've been talking about steering. What forms did this unequal treatment take?
But Gladys says steering is an imprecise term, and it's often used as sort of a catch-all for various behaviors. But for example, telling one person that there is no housing in an area in your price range, you won't find anything for your money there, but then showing housing in that price range in that area to others. We saw that happen. Making unsolicited comments about the race or ethnicity or religion of people who live in an area, or comments about the schools, comments about crime, about resale values, as a way of encouraging or often discouraging someone from living there, while giving contrary information or being silent on those matters with another customer, that's steering. You saw an example there of an agent telling the white buyer to avoid an area because of poor resale values, while encouraging the minority buyer to look there. We also saw differences in the level of service. Overall, our white testers got 50%, 50% more listings than their black counterparts. Now, we've been discussing this in terms of individual buyers, but look at it neighborhood by neighborhood for a minute. Both testers would ask for an area, let's say within half an hour of downtown. And that area, that circle, would include many communities and neighborhoods and schools. But sometimes listings in the wider residential parts of that circle would be given only to our white buyer. So minorities were steered around those communities. And that's really what we were testing for. But we also saw something else. We had minority communities inside the circle for both buyers where neither buyer is given the listings, although homes are for sale in the price range. These were the communities with more than a modest amount of Black population. The agents were steering around those areas for all buyers. Now, our legal experts said, wait, who has the lawsuit in that case? It's a long list. Not only are the white and minority homebuyers being steered illegally, both the white and minority homebuyers are being harmed by being steered around those minority neighborhoods. But the communities themselves are being harmed, the governments, and anyone who has tried to sell a home in those areas, and their listing brokers have a lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act against the brokerages that are steering around their communities. And you know why? Fewer buyers means lower prices, lower home values, lower home equity, and less tax money for schools and playgrounds and libraries. Here's a video clip with sort of a classic example of steering. An agent tells one family, a man shopping for his wife and teenager, that an area would be a good place to live with the nicest neighbors, while the agent warns another family, a man shopping for his wife and teenager, that it's a dangerous place. Just take me a second to start that clip. Here we go. Please stand by.
Kelvin Toon is a Black man in his early 50s, and he went in to meet with an agent involving a test in the Brentwood community, a community that is 80% Hispanic and Black. The agent communicated to Kelvin, our Black tester, that she enjoyed meeting with clients from the Brentwood area.
Every time I get a new listing in Brentwood or a new client, I get so excited because there's nice people.
When we sent Kelvin's counterpart in to meet with the same agent, the white tester was actually warned about Brentwood not being a nice place.
The nursing home we need to be near is in Brentwood.
Okay.
And so we found a couple that are in Brentwood.
Pretty close to each other.
Okay. And it just seemed like those would be handy also for going.
Do you want to give me them and I'll look into them for you? Or?
Yeah, I can do that.
That warning came later to the white tester saying there was concern about gang activity going on in Brentwood. This agent wanted the white tester to know, but that information wasn't provided to Kelvin, the black tester. The listings centered black tester Kelvin in Brentwood with 27 house listings, while the white tester got 0 listings in Brentwood and was directed towards much whiter neighborhoods.
So, Bill, do you think the agents included in the documentary were knowingly steering? Some mentioned that they shouldn't be saying what they were saying, or do you think some of it was an unconscious bias?
Gladys, we did hear some agents say, I shouldn't be saying this, but this is, that's the real estate equivalent of hold my beer. So something bad's about to happen. But about unconscious bias, I think the first point to understand is that it doesn't matter at all legally. The Fair Housing Act and your state and local laws cover behavior, conduct, not thoughts or motives. The law is not a mind reader. We don't ask burglars if they intended to come into the house. We don't ask tax cheats if they intended not to report their income. If an agent is treating one person better than another similarly situated person, and the difference between them is one of the 7 categories in the Fair Housing Act, the agent has violated the law. To remind you, those categories are color, race, religion, national origin, disability, sex, and family status, usually meaning having children or being pregnant. You also may have state and local laws that may include other categories. Now, though it doesn't matter legally, it is interesting to speculate about the motivations of the agents. If you want to stop something from happening, you have to consider why it's happening. Some agents may, in effect, be profiling, assuming that the person of color can't really afford homes in that price range or can't qualify for the mortgage and will be wasting the agent's time, while accepting that same price range without question from a white buyer. One of the tricky parts about profiling is that it doesn't work. You know, we usually talk about profiling as though it's a shortcut to success. There are TV shows about FBI crime profilers. But experts in various fields say the real problem with profiling is that it is so ineffective. Let's look at a different context. Let's say you want to stop school shootings from happening. Maybe you have a profile of who plays video games that are violent or who dresses a certain way. These are not good predictors of who will be a school shooter. You understand the profile fits too many good kids and may miss the kid who's planning an attack. What's a better predictor? Acquiring weapons, telling other students about plans, don't be in the cafeteria on Thursday. Or think about airport safety and counterterrorism work. Religion is not a good way to identify who will be a terrorist. You miss, I guess the main point about it that the police tell us is that it wastes investigative resources looking at the wrong people and causes you to miss the people you should be paying attention to. And if you think of it, that's the same problem in real estate. Race is not a good way to identify which customers can afford a home. You leave too much money on the table if you assume that people of color can't be good customers. Besides, it's illegal. So why might some agents do it? Some agents may think consciously or not, that they'll make money faster with less effort if they show people homes where you'll feel comfortable. You heard an agent saying that. But why assume from anyone's race or job or anything else that they want segregated neighborhoods? Besides, say it with me, it's illegal. Some agents may be anticipating or bowing to a bias that they expect from others. Maybe an agent fears that the sellers would be angry if they brought a minority buyer to the home. Or the agent might fear that the neighbors, who are, of course, potential customers in the future as sellers, might be upset if the agent is thought to be integrating the block or the area. Or agents could think that appraisers or lenders may be biased, making it hard to close a sale. There is evidence of disparities in appraisal and in lending, but again, under the fair housing laws, none of that matters. Steering is illegal. I suppose it's possible that a few agents somewhere are just outright prejudiced, but I assume that that is a tiny group, so small as to be irrelevant to our discussion. As others have pointed out, there's just too much steering for it to be accounted for by outright prejudice. One commentator said it can't just be bad people doing it, the good people have to be doing it too. You know, in general, on issues of race, it's pretty easy to apply all the heat to the question of who's the racist, who in our office might be a bigot. Are you saying I'm a bigot? And you can burn up a lot of energy and get nowhere. It may be more productive to apply light to the question, how does it work in our office? What are our procedures? Is what we're doing sure to be treating people equally? Because under the law, it's conduct, it's what you do that counts. I do think it's interesting to consider the point of view of the home buyer, even if in our case, they were actors testing the agents. Our testers often came back from the real estate office telling us that agent was so nice. She was so helpful. They only learned the truth when our team brought the buyers together to watch videos and to see the maps of the listings that they'd been given. You'll meet some of the testers in this video clip and also hear from a fair housing expert who works with them. Just a moment. Here we go.
It almost makes me wish that the racism is more explicit so that I would know about it.
Too often I hear people who maybe aren't as familiar with this kind of work say, oh, well, they were just testers. But all you have to do is tell someone, which I have to do on a fairly regular basis, that you were turned down because of your race, and tell them the circumstances that occurred on a particular test. And you will see just how real and painful that injury is.
Belmont, you know, it's okay, it's good, you're very close to the city. Some of them are not as nice, Belmont.
I do remember him. He was nice, and I do remember him pointing out on the map.
Oh, he loved that map. I remember that.
Yeah, he had the map, and he's like, you know.
Some of these towns, in my opinion, are not necessarily the greatest in terms of school districts, safety, you know, crime, resale.
You know, one of the patterns that I guess startled us was that over and over again, we would see agents begin their presentations to the buyers. Remember, these were new customers with inappropriate comments or information that violates the fair housing laws. This agent with the map, he looked like General Patton planning the invasion of Sicily, but he had a different plan for home buyers of different races. For the whites, it was don't get off the highway until you get past these neighborhoods. I think it's important that this didn't seem to be offhand casual comments. No one was spitting out a slur when someone cuts them off in traffic on a home tour. No, this seemed to be the sales pitch. For these agents, it seemed to be the standard guidance for how to narrow your home search. I hate to say it, but for these agents, it seemed that steering was an important part of the service that they were selling.
So, Bill, what role did schools play in the actions of agents?
I don't know how it works in Virginia, but on Long Island, over and over, the agents would tell our buyers everything is decided by schools. Agents touted one district over another. Some districts were blue ribbon and others were declining. Often they gave different information to different buyers. Let's step back for a moment. America's school districts are so segregated by race in many communities that directing someone to certain schools is the same as directing them to areas with higher or lower minority population, even without mentioning race. It's hard to believe it, but America's schools are more segregated now than they were 30 years ago. More segregated now than when I graduated from high school. School segregation and housing segregation are intertwined. They feed each other. Around the country now, some agents have picked up the idea, well, I can't talk about schools. You may have heard agents say, oh, I can't mention schools. But the Fair Housing Act doesn't say that. The legal experts tell us that agents can give straightforward, factual information. Agents can answer questions. You can say where your kids went to school. Agents can refer customers to websites or brochures with information. The problem arises when the agents are picking and choosing districts for customers, especially when they're picking and choosing different districts for different customers. Or when agents are making comments about the demographics in schools to steer customers. Here's a discussion of schools from our video. Then we'll get back into schools a bit more. This is an introductory discussion of schools, and you'll hear from our law professor who was an advisor on our project. Here we go. Just takes a second.
I said, do you really want your future children going to Amityville School District?
We're going to try and stay away from Freeport, Roosevelt, Hempstead for now because of the school district.
This part, the Salisbury part, demand, because the schools are much, much, much better.
In Newsday's 86-pair tests, agents often applied a laser-like focus on school districts, highlighting their perceived quality when recommending places that house hunters should consider buying or avoid. Fair housing experts say touting or disparaging school districts can put agents in jeopardy because talking about school districts can be taken as a euphemism for race.
There's a few districts that I know I would I won't look in those towns.
Oh, okay.
You know, like Freeport and Baldwin and Amityville, which is part of Massapequa schools, but it's just certain parts of Massapequa.
If the customer asked about the quality of the schools and the agent responded with accurate information, I think the agent would be fine. The problem with talking about differentials in schools is that at least in the last 10 or 15 years, that has been a proxy for race. They don't mention the race of the community. Good schools are available in these areas. Those areas I'd stay away from because they have poor schools. I want to ask, did you tell that to the other tester? If you're only giving that information to one tester of the two, and the only difference is the race, then you've provided what I call differential service.
If you're in Massapequa, you only want school district 23. Okay. You don't want 6 in Massapequa because that takes in Amityville, and we're not going to like those schools.
Now, I remember that agent writing there at the end. She was very helpfully making for the buyers a list of schools and then sending the two buyers from the real estate office back to the newspaper office with different lists. Now, schools are the hardest part of this. So let's think through one more wrinkle together. How do you discuss school quality without violating the Fair Housing Act? First, you all understand that you don't have to talk about race to be steering. You all understand that if the districts vary in race and you're promoting one over another, you're steering, especially if you're giving different information or being silent on that information with the other buyer. Some companies suggest that agents not talk about schools. Others suggest that they limit information to factual questions, answering factual information. But stay away from the trap of using vague labels or responding to vague labels such as good schools or nice schools or high performing schools. The idea is that real estate agents, I'm sorry, are not experts in schools. And not everybody wants the same school. Some people want the lacrosse program and some want the band program. If they were buying a boat, they'd go look at boats. And if they're interested in the schools, they should go visit schools. Here's a complicated part. If it's okay to share websites with objective information, is it okay to share and talk about school test scores? Here's the wrinkle. Write this on the blackboard 100 times. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. School test scores don't tell you how good a school is. I'll let you do the next 98. School test scores tell you mostly how wealthy and educated are the parents who send their kids to that school. In America, wealth and education of parents is a pretty good predictor, not perfect, but good predictor of their children's test scores. And in America, race is a pretty good predictor of the wealth and education of the parents. So you see the problem. A high performing school, because it has higher test scores, may just be a wealthier area. And a school with lower test scores might actually be the higher performing one, where good teachers are bringing up the scores of students who are growing up in working class households. Now, word about this is getting around. Just recently, greatschools.org, the school ranking website that so many agents refer customers to, has realized this pitfall. It's changing its ratings in states where it was basing the ratings on nothing but test scores. It said, wait a minute, that's just perpetuating segregation. It's perpetuating this idea that schools are better and white schools are better. The National Association of Realtors has spoken up in favor of this change. So you want a bottom line. Can you talk about school test scores and refer parents to websites listing them? Yes, the professor says you can. But you might think about, is it right to do this in a country that's as segregated as ours? That's a moral question, I guess, not a legal question. NAR is actively working on trying to get you fuller guidance about schools. NAR says this is the area that's most likely to change in the next few years, because we're really understanding how the advice has been perpetuating segregation. NAR is making a film on schools and guidance by or for agents, and that's coming out later this year.
So what was the reaction from the real estate industry and government?
Well, I guess first it's fair to say that we may have raised some awareness of these issues. Often I'm asked what happened to the agents in these videos. We know that disciplinary hearings started and are continuing probably through the rest of this year. We know that one agent gave up her license voluntarily rather than go through a disciplinary process. Overall, there are about 100 people in New York in danger of losing or not being able to renew their license. There are about 30 some agents who failed tests, and then there are their brokers, and often there's more than one broker of record, and so the brokers are in danger of losing their licenses. We did see the agents and the brokers who were called to testify in public before a state Senate committee hearing. So they were sworn in, and you can watch it on YouTube. Some handled it well. Some said, you know, I hadn't understood that I was violating the law, but I realize now that what I said was inappropriate. Others got sort of a public thrashing. The agent who you saw saying, follow the school bus, see what mothers are waiting to meet the bus. She said she just meant for the customers to learn where the bus routes were. The agent who said the Hispanics are taking over the neighborhood, he said he meant that in a positive way. The most surprising part of the hearing was that the brokers all said that they had reviewed the videos and the tests, and they found that nobody had done anything wrong. Their position seemed to be that if steering isn't announced, if you don't say out loud, I am now going to be violating the law, then it's not illegal. But you know better. After the hearing, the New York State Senate unanimously approved changes to state laws. And we're waiting for the other half of the legislature to make a decision about this, but the Senate rarely does anything unanimous. So it appears these will become law in New York. And I mention them to you because changes in state laws tend to creep from state to state. Let me summarize those for you briefly. More testing, and the testing is not to be done by the normal agency regulating real estate licenses, but by the state attorney general's office. More fees on renewal of licenses, $30 for a broker, $10 for a salesperson to pay for that testing. Requiring a standard procedure for taking in new clients. Better training. Our team found that the training in New York was very poor. Training on implicit bias, the legacy of segregation. Damages available to victims of discrimination. Doubling the fines on those who discriminate. And guess where the money goes from the fines? You got it, to pay for more testing. So that the politicians in New York clearly understand that testing is very important to if you want to stop speeding, you'll add enforcement. It has a deterrent effect. Also, at the federal level, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has already begun to, shall we say, resume enforcement of the Fair Housing Act under the new president and the new HUD secretary.
So, based on your investigations, what do you think are the best ways to combat racism in real estate?
Well, Gladys, let's talk about some of the fixes that have been proposed. The National Association of Realtors has responded vigorously to our investigation, and I think its efforts are worth discussing. It has a new program called ACT, A-C-T, A for accountability, C for culture change, T for training. And let's just go through that quickly. First, NAR has been working with state associations, your Virginia Realtors and others, to examine all the state laws and to look at where there are gaps in state licensing and to discuss trying to beef up enforcement of the fair housing laws in the states. That's something completely new. To have a national trade group encouraging greater enforcement at the state level. I think it's because people understand that if there's not enforcement of what's there now, there will be additional laws. NAR is also developing a voluntary program. Companies and brokers can volunteer to have self-testing, to have testing done of their agents. Again, heading off further government intervention by taking some responsibility themselves. Now, you might think there aren't any companies that want to test their own agents, but that's not true. The CEO of Realogy, which is the largest real estate company in America, it owns the Century 21 and Coldwell Banker brands and Sotheby's International and others, said, yes, we should be testing our own agents. So NAR is saying, we'll meet you halfway. We'll work out a program to help make relationships with groups that can do that testing, sort of put a cookbook together of everything you need to consider. So that's under accountability. C for culture change. Think back a bit. you know that now fair housing is a core component of your realtor code of ethics, not just in April, all year. But you may not know, may not be old enough to remember that for 50 years, that same code of ethics prohibited selling a home in a white neighborhood to a person of color. That continued into the 1970s. There was sort of a code word, don't sell to anyone who might be detrimental to the neighborhood. So let's acknowledge that cultures can be changed and that change can take a long time. There is a long tradition in America of legal activities, including redlining, blockbusting, racial covenants on deeds, predatory subprime lending that stripped home equity out of minority neighborhoods, all were legal at the time. We're not saying that real estate agents created segregation. You may have read Richard Rothstein's wonderful book, The Color of Law, which gives that history. It lays segregation at the feet of government action back to the 1930s, especially when financing was available after World War II in the 40s to the white GIs only coming back from the war when the modern suburbs were being developed. So these are not just historical facts, but let's acknowledge that their effects continue. Even this year, we've seen studies on the differences in how appraisals are done in Black neighborhoods, large studies with some very surprising anecdotes, like the family that took down the pictures of the Black relatives and raised their home value more than $100,000. And let's agree that the effects of segregation carry down from generation to generation, starting with the differences in wealth creation. Home equity is the money that the grandkids will use to buy homes and go to college. Now, accountability, culture change. You know, last year, NAR said, issued a public apology for its historic contributions to segregation and discrimination. And I watched some of the chatter on Twitter and Facebook, and I saw some agents saying, wait, I missed it. What are we apologizing for? So let's acknowledge that culture change can take a while. Now, training. New York has already improved its training classes. NAR has made a couple of changes I'd like to mention. NAR this spring is rolling out a new course on implicit bias in real estate. Now, NAR has shared training materials on implicit bias before, sort of generic ones, but it has a new 3-hour course that it will be rolling out. It's a course for brokers, and the idea is that brokers can then lead a discussion or help teach the course to their agents. And many of you are familiar with the new tool that came out last fall, Fairhaven. It's sort of a game or simulation. And many of you, I hope, have tried it and may have contests in your associations to get everybody to try it. It takes about an hour and it's really well done. You make choices and experience the pitfalls of fair housing, either as an agent trying to close deals or as a customer. And, you know, in a way, Fairhaven is trying to teach not only the law, but empathy. Perspective. I think it's well worth the effort. It's at fairhaven.realtor. Finally, NAR is making a film about good role models. After all, 2 of the 12 companies in our investigation passed all of their tests, and we described their experience. And NAR has new awards for fair housing champions, realtors who prosper while following the fair housing laws. I think all of this seems useful. A couple of comments from a layman's perspective. I realize that quality control is difficult in an industry where agents are self-motivated, independent, working from home or out of an SUV. Some are part-time. You know, during our tests, as journalists at the newspaper office, we would send out the testers, like air traffic controllers. Then we'd watch them come back and watch the videos, and we would discuss how hard would it be to stop steering in a real estate office. We all understand that it's not a fix to say, well, we respond if anyone complains, because we all understand that no one would ever complain because no one would know they're being steered. No one knows how any other customer is treated. It did appear to us that the agents in our test didn't have rigorous standards for what they do and don't do with every customer. No checklist. We would see agents come back, one with a thick folder and one with a skinny folder from the same agent. That seems like something you could fix. You could argue that it would help if we had more diversity and employment in the real estate workforce. And that would definitely have many benefits. But keep in mind that that's not a cure-all for steering. We saw steering and discrimination by agents of all backgrounds, just as you can see police brutality by some minority officers. That's why people talk about systemic problems. It seemed clear that many agents in our tests were unfamiliar with the minority neighborhoods. You know, after my banking stories in Atlanta, one bank put its lenders on a bus to tour the wonderful new homes in a Black subdivision, a subdivision under construction that clearly from its location was going to be a Black neighborhood. I remember them looking through the windows, marveling at this magnificent kitchen. Maybe a bus tour wouldn't be a bad idea, again, to break down some stereotypes. We did notice that our large real estate brands had more than 200 offices on Long Island, but not a single one was in those communities where most of the Black residents lived, not one. And those companies didn't represent many sellers in those minority communities either. I have to wonder about the role of brokers and what actions brokers take. For example, brokers, do you make an effort to know whether steering is happening in your offices? Do you check on which listings agents give customers? Do you come along sometime later and look to see which neighborhoods or schools the customer was given and what other areas might have matched up with the customer's actual criteria? You know, we would watch our agents interview the tester, the home buyer, and then turn to a computer screen and start to click in the MLS to generate listings. And it's at that moment when they're clicking little square, checking off communities or school districts to generate, that's the moment when steering happens, right there. And I wonder, brokers, does your MLS send you any reports on which communities and schools your agents are choosing? Those would be a red flag that you could then look into further. If your MLS doesn't give you reports like that, do you demand them? I also wonder if brokerages have a consistent way of qualifying customers. Do you have requirements that apply to everyone? Do you require pre-approval from everyone? That's okay. Or do you require pre-approval from no one? That's okay. But if you're leaving it up to the agent in the moment, that's where differences are going to creep in. And it's your license on the line. Do you ask credit scores of everyone or no one? Do you ask income of everyone or no one? Do you check ID of everyone or no one? Let me give law professor Bob Schwinn from Kentucky just a word on this subject in a short video clip. Let me show you a brief clip here. Here we go.
I'm a law professor at the University of Kentucky, and I've been a law professor for a long number of years. All we're asking in these tests, you've got two people who come in and ask for exactly the same thing. Why don't you give them the same listings? Why don't you pre-qualify them in exactly the same way? It's not that big a burden. This is a law. This should be treated like a tax law or any other law. You have to obey this law, and particularly if you're in a licensed business like real estate agents, if you can't obey the law, you ought to just get out.
Now, okay, the professor really steps up to the plate there and takes a swing at it. But I think part of the problem is that you all want to obey the law. but may not be spotting the gaps where discrimination and unequal treatment can happen. Now, let me close with this. NAR offers two simple, straightforward suggestions on ways to avoid steering, and let's look at those quickly. One, NAR suggests that agents provide customers with listings based on their objective criteria. Home size, a corner lot or not, a pool or not, other attributes. Not on vague terms such as nice neighborhood or good schools or safe. That's one. Second, NAR suggests that you pay attention to implicit bias, unconscious bias. In other words, the blind spots that we all have. When evaluating what a customer may objectively want, ask yourself, why may I have eliminated certain areas? Now, I'm a layman, but I have a question. Aren't those two pieces of good advice somewhat contradictory? Because if you give only the listings that fit the objective criteria, why would you ever be eliminating any areas? I think I'm in league with the professor here. Why not just give them all the listings? If agents gave every customer all the listings within their price range, with the right number of bedrooms, any other criteria the customer is given, then we wouldn't have steering. It may be that the best way to stop illegal steering may be to stop steering customers at all. Why not give them all the listings? That's my layman's point of view. I trust that you all want to make sure that everyone who calls or emails or walks into your office now or someday is treated equally. Here's my hope. I hope that you will share our stories and the 40-minute film with everyone in your office. Post it on Facebook for your customers. It's all at the same address, newsday.com/divided. The stories are called Long Island Divided, and we called the film Testing the Divide. It's all at the same address. But don't stop there. Have a conversation. Too much emphasis, I think, can go toward the question of how could those agents have said those things? I would never say anything like that. We should root out agents who say those things. There's too much heat can go to that topic and neglect the other part, which is, they can make a map of all the listings that we give to every customer and compare those maps. It's easy to focus the conversation on who's the bigot, who's biased, and not enough attention on the question of how does it work in our office? Do we use the same pre-approval criteria for everyone? Do we send the same listings to everyone? What do we need to do to make sure that everyone is treated the same? I appreciate you inviting me to meet with you. I hope that this has given you something to discuss with your colleagues and with your customers. And I'm hoping that you will have questions that you've typed in or will now type in that we can address.
Thank you. It's for this very thorough exploration of Newsday's expose, Bill. This gives each of us much to consider and even challenges us to look inwardly at our own potentially innate or subconscious biases. Now, I do believe we have some questions. One was, how would sports conversations become a conflict?
Yeah, I think what I said there was probably unclear or misunderstood. What I'm saying was some people want sports and some people want music. And what I mean by that is don't assume that this is a good school and therefore it's the good school for everybody. It may not be the right school for that customer. But yes, if the customer says, I want to know who has the best football program, my kid's going to be a tight end, in the NFL. Well, sure, you could talk about, well, I've heard they have great football program and that coach is fantastic. That you can do. The warning is first against assuming that something you've heard or read about one school means it's the right school for everybody. And second, making sure to give the same information to everybody. Send everybody home with the brochure. Send everybody home with the same website. Don't make different lists of schools. Don't look at someone's clothing or face or voice or education and decide that they'll like this school, but somebody else, you don't mention that school to. It's not that sports that gets you in the problem, it's unequal treatment or assumptions that get you in trouble.
Another question was, what are some of the consequences that these violators received?
Well, so they're just facing the possible loss of their licenses. I mean, essentially, the first thing that happens is they go to renew their license, and it's already happened that the state wouldn't renew some of their licenses, at least for the moment, because they're facing disciplinary action. So some of them now are in limbo, waiting and can't practice. And you know, I personally, we were not focused on discipline of individual agents as some sort of goal of the project. If you were doing a lawsuit about an agent, you would go test that agent with a pair and then another pair and then another pair to go to court on that agent. That wasn't what our story was about. We were doing multiple pairs at each company because our emphasis was on the companies, on the brokerages, on the brands. We weren't focused on discipline for individual agents, but I understand the agents are in these videos, and some of them, you know, were clearly breaking the law and are going to face some state discipline for that.
Our next question is, if a customer is not pre-qualified, is there any problem with referring them to an in-house mortgage broker?
No, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm definitely not a lawyer in your state, but I'm not aware of a fair housing problem with that. All right. Now, you may have consumer rights issues. I mean, I could imagine, for example, hey, investigative reporter here, I want to know, is that a broker that you have some sort of relationship with? Do they pay you? Is that legal? I want to know, do they get the best rate if they go with that broker? I want to know, does everybody get referred to that same broker or only some people? And that might be a form of steering some people into a higher rate loan and some to a better deal. I want to know about those things. But just from a fair housing perspective, at the first cut, you're allowed to apply requirements that people are pre-approved, and you're allowed to say, Coldwell Banker works with this brokerage, and here's our favorite broker. Here's their card. Call them if you want, or can I have them call them? Sure. People did that all the time in our test, and no expert thought that that presented a problem. The problem was, of course, some were pre-approved and got helped, were not pre-approved and got help. Some were not pre-approved and didn't get help. I never take people out who aren't pre-approved, but we know you did. That's where the problem came in.
Any suggestions for additional training for realtors outside of the NAR resources mentioned earlier?
Well, I'll mention a couple of books. I mentioned the case for, I mentioned the Color of Law, Richard Rothstein.
Yep, good book.
I'll mention a historical book, The Fight for Fair Housing, by Squires, a professor, gives more of the history. And, you know, it's interesting to know that history because, you know, Walter Mondale died last month, right? The former vice president, presidential candidate, but also former senator from Minnesota who wrote the Fair Housing Law and who in interviews with Newsday and others through the years said, you know, it's the law we never really enforced. There's a lot of the Fair Housing Act that we just never really it's the law we didn't enforce. And, you know, he's in the ground now, but there's more effort this year than there was last year to enforce the Fair Housing Act. And it may continue to go in spurts like that. But I think it's interesting to know that history and to get a sense of the causes and effects of the segregation. And so I think those two books are useful, especially for that perspective.
How would you suggest responding to a prospective buyer asking about good areas or good schools?
Well, I might have mentioned I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not your lawyer, and I'm not a lawyer in Virginia, but I have a suggestion for you. I'm here from more brokers. I hear from more agents who say we're encouraging those in our offices to encourage the buyers to do their own homework. I'm going to give you all the listings for the number of bedrooms within so-and-so distance, how close to downtown you want to be, or what are your other criteria? You need to be near the nursing home where your mother lives or whatever. I'm going to give you all those listings until you start whittling them down. When you tell me you want a garage, I'll check garage and you'll get fewer listings. But until then, I'm going to send them all to you. And that seems like good advice. Let me just mention this perspective. If the guy fixing my roof later this week, I tell him to do it one way and he says, sorry, I can't do it that way. You know, there's a building code. I can't do that. I would understand there's a building code. Most of your customers would understand if the car mechanic says, I can't put that part on, it's not street legal. And we're used to there being laws in society, and we're used to professionals telling us, sorry, I can't do it that way. There's a law, I have to do it this way. And so part of my message for you is it's okay to say there's a Fair Housing Act. There are state and federal laws that limit what I can say in answer to your question about what's good or crime or schools. You need to do your own homework. It's okay to say that. And I mention this partly because I know that agents are under a lot of pressures from internet-only companies and the Zillows of the world, pressure from in a tough market. And sometimes those pressures can lead you to feeling like you need to do things that are a little outside of the bounds, or your customers introduce these issues. I understand that's often where the fair housing issues come in. And that's, for example, this problem that you've maybe all heard about now is these buyer love letters in a tight market. I read a Wall Street Journal article just last week encouraging buyers to write those letters. Buyers are often told they should write these letters to sellers saying, pick me, but they have, as NAR has pointed out, fair housing implications. Usually from the letter, you can tell race, background, family status, national origin, disability status, and religion for most of these letters in the photos. So they're basically inviting sellers to pick buyers who look like them, who they can imagine using the playset. And I'm hearing from an increasing number of sellers agents who say, we're telling buyers agents not to send those letters. It's in the notes. And we're telling the sellers we won't pass them on if we get any, because that's not the basis on which we should be choosing which offer to accept. But you can see how that sort of takes some gumption. It takes, buck up and be willing to push back a little bit against these things. That's my advice.
Right. We want to thank you so much, Bill, for presenting this look into Long Island Divided. And we thank VPAR and WAR for partnering with Hurrah to make this happen. We again thank Atlantic Bay Mortgage Group, Atlantic Coast Mortgage, and Prosper Insurance for their generosity in sponsoring today. If you'd like to read the full Long Island Divided expose, go to newsday.com/divided. I know today alone has given me plenty of food for thought. So thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you all. Thank you.